Welcome to this virtual event on ASEAN Sustainable Capital Markets, Regulators' Perspectives. My name is Mushtaq Kapasi. I'm Chief Representative for Asia Pacific for the International Capital Market Association. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mr. Sani Ismail, Principal Financial Sector Specialist at the Asian Development Bank, for a presentation on the markets before our panel discussion. Sani, over to you.
Thank you, Mushtaq. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on your respective time zones. Let me begin by thanking Mushtaq and the ICMA team for organizing this very opportune webinar on sustainable finance, certainly an area that is of interest to many of us. And I think the current situation with the pandemic highlights the importance of sustainable finance. So just a few introduction slides from ADB, the Asian Development Bank's perspective. Let me begin by just sort of emphasizing the way we look at sustainable finance, ADB and sustainable finance, in terms of our strategy 2030. So, we have several operational priorities in the strategy, and two of the priorities are actually very relevant to sustainable finance. First is on tackling climate change, building climate resilience, climate disaster resilience, and enhancing environmental sustainability. So just as a target, 75% of the number of ADB's committed operations will be supporting climate change mitigation and adaptation by 2030. And cumulatively, we're looking at 80 billion from 2019 to 2030. The other operational priority is of course, on fostering regional cooperation and integration. So if you combine these two operational priorities, you can understand where ADB is coming from in terms of sustainable finance. Specifically, in terms of ADB's role within this sphere, within this area, you can see in the slide, we very much would like to be a trusted knowledge partner in terms of research. And the latest research we have done on this area is on green finance recovery strategies. We are also see ourselves as a facilitator through our technical assistance to ACMF, the ASEAN Capital Markets Forum. Many of the speakers today will be from the ACMF, credit enhancement products, as well as capacity building for newly developing capital market regulators. As an issuer, ADB has issued approximately 7.6 billion of green bonds since the introduction in 2015. And of course, we look at ICMA standards as a benchmark. ADB is also an investor, anchor investor for green projects. So these are, in summary, the role that ADB plays in sustainable finance. And this slide basically shows you the relationship between ADB and the ASEAN Capital Market Forum. We have been supporting ACMF since 2008, with various technical assistance. And I can safely say that the reason why ADB has been a strong supporter of ACMF is really ACMF has done a lot of good work, and initiatives have been very well-grounded and with high impact. None better demonstrate this than the ASEAN Green, Social, and Sustainability Bond Standards, which was launched in 2018-2019. And you can see the success of these standards. For instance, total issuances of these three categories of standards have been approximately 7.5 billion, of which 3.8 is from the ASEAN Green Bond label, and another 3 billion is the ASEAN Sustainability Bond. Beyond so subsequently, after ACMF launched these standards, ADB also supported the ACMF for the roadmap on ASEAN Sustainable Capital Market, and I'm sure subsequently we'll have a bit of discussion on what that roadmap is all about. So going forward, these are some of the challenges we see in terms of the sustainable finance, the need to reduce fragmentation and duplication, as well as to have a neutral, unifying voice on sustainable finance. And that is why we think it is very important to have this neutral platform. And on that note, we are very happy to support the SFIA, the Sustainable Finance Institute for Asia. So I think this really represents the next phase of ADB's support in this area. In terms of the roadmap, just very briefly, and I know the ACMF colleagues are still discussing these proposals, but just very briefly, these are two of the sub-projects, if you like, the ADB will be keen and to support ACMF. One is on the taxonomy. I think we all know that how important taxonomy is in terms of identifying and capturing sort of the green projects that will be eligible for green investment, particularly during the COVID green recovery phase. The second project that we propose is on transition bonds. So I think it's a natural progression after having the green, social, and sustainable standards. The next we should be looking at is transition bonds, which looks at how do we transform from industries that are essentially brown and using green matrix, how do we bring them over so that they can, through the project financing, practice more green and sustainable practices. I think I'll end my presentation there. Just to note that, as I mentioned, we will continue supporting ACMF. We're very proud of this partnership, and this is something that we look at supporting and continuing for the medium term. With that final concluding remark, I'd like to hand over, and it is actually my honor to introduce Eugene Wong, who's actually the CEO of Sophia, and he will be moderating the session onwards. Over to you, Eugene. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sunny. That's a very kind introduction. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. We are very fortunate because we have a panel of senior and distinguished regulators who, together with their colleagues from the other 6 ASEAN countries, are working very hard to bring sustainability to the ASEAN capital markets. And they do this through the ASEAN Capital Markets Forum, which is the grouping of all 10 securities regulators in ASEAN, who are tasked with connecting and bringing change to the ASEAN capital markets. So let me first do a very quick introduction of the panelists today. First, we have Zainal Islan from the Securities Commission Malaysia. Islan is actually the Deputy Chief Executive, followed by Efiro Amatong, who is a commissioner with the Philippine Securities and Exchange Commission. We have Mr. Zung Vuchi, who is Director General International of the Securities Commission of Vietnam, the SSC Vietnam. And the SSC Vietnam is actually the chair of the ACMF this year. And of course, I saved the last for best. We have Gillian Tan, who is Assistant Managing Director for Development and International from the MAS. So, it's very interesting that every day I open the papers and I will see something about ESG or climate change. The whole world seems to be pivoting towards this, especially after a very terrible experience with COVID. There are so many calls for a green and resilient recovery, and this is really to lift our present and to secure our future. But ACMF has actually pivoted way even before COVID towards sustainability. I mean, it's been very prescient of the ACMF. And Sunny mentioned just now about ACMF's very successful suite of sustainable bond standards, which were released in 2017 and 2018. The labeled issuances have totaled 7.5 billion, and there's another 3.2 billion, which are aligned but not labeled to these standards. So by all means, I would consider these standards very much a success. And when you first started with the suite of sustainable bond standards, you took the very brave step of actually excluding fossil fuels. That was really quite game-changing, and in fact showed global leadership, and it showed your seriousness in addressing sustainability. So now if we look at where ASEAN is actually going to be the 4th largest economic bloc by 2050. I'm sure the ACMF has its hands totally full with all sorts of things that you have to do to finance this growth, to ensure that capital is allocated the right way. But you've very boldly taken on the mandate for sustainability, and you've made this a priority. Can I ask why you've done this? Perhaps we can start with Zung from the SSC.
Thank you, Eugene. And as discussed in the presentation of Sunny, and we see that ADB is committed to the ASEAN and also ACMF initiatives. And we see ASEAN, we all formally committed to achieving sustainable development in the charter documents, aiming at creating a regional community, seeing that we ASEAN community and 10 members ASEAN now signatories to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, SDG. But according to the United Nations Progress Report in 2020, none of our members are really 100% on track to meet the DG by 2030. I mean, 17 goals of SDG. But you see that as a bloc, ASEAN, we are all committed to sustainability. And ICMF, very much aware of the importance of the sustainable development. It is for the reason, and it is set in the 2015 ASEAN Charter, and also in ASEAN Community Vision 2025, and it's in detail in the ACMF Roadmap for ASEAN Sustainable Capital Market, and also in the ACMF 2025 Vision. And you know that in ASEAN 2015 Charter, it says ASEAN is committed to ensuring sustainable development for the benefit of the present and the future generations, and to place a well-being, livelihood, and welfare of the peoples of the center of ASEAN community building process. So enlarge ASEAN as a group committed. And in ASEAN Community Vision 2025, we emphasize on environmental protection for now and future, adapting and responding to climate change and green technology and development. And you all know that and observe that the climate change impacts on our 10 member states. For Vietnam now, it is happening across the center of Vietnam, where normal people are suffering from typhoon and storm. And typhoon tore a destructive path, flooding hundreds of thousands of homes, whipping off roofs and knocking out power. And you see, typhoon and storm in ASEAN can cause significant damage to infrastructure, disrupting businesses as usual for investors. So we see that it's very important for us to work on all initiatives, and with the getting support from institutions outside ASEAN, to have the same toward the same goal for the sustainability in ASEAN. And our ICMF regulators set together to work on all the recommendations, comments, and opinions, and also initiatives for the market to cope with the challenges of the environment impacts. Over to you, Eugene.
Yeah, actually, if I can come in here, Eugene. No, first of all, I mean, a huge thank you to Eugene and to ICMA for having me on this panel. It's a very interesting topic, and it's quite an esteemed panel. I'm very honored to be here. Now, Eugene, you asked about why sustainability is important to ASEAN. And actually, I mean, as you rightly pointed out, I think ACMF has been looking at this area for quite some time. But it wasn't the case with everyone, and for a lot of people, I think COVID-19 really sent a very sharp wake-up call on the need for resilience, for sustainability in our economies and our societies. And what was heartening was to see that governments around the world understand that sustainability is important and it must be tied in to COVID recovery plans. So we've seen this in the EU, we've seen this with the Chinese, with the Koreans, and also with ASEAN. There is a reaffirmed focus, I think, on cooperation, on environmental protection. And today's panel is really just one of many examples of what we're doing on that front. And when I think about this, and I think about ASEAN, it's very interesting because ASEAN is both in a position of strength and also vulnerability. We are strong because, I mean, as Eugene rightly pointed out, we are poised for accelerated economic development over the next decade. Yet we are also vulnerable. We are vulnerable to climate change, given our very long coastlines, our low-lying topography. And, you know, Director General Sung's comments just now about typhoons really hit home for me. You know, for many in the ASEAN region, climate change is not a theoretical construct. It is a reality, and we need to take urgent action. So really what we need in ASEAN, I think, is sustainable and inclusive growth. We will need to adopt a transitional approach, moving from perhaps light green to dark green, and recognize that a well-planned transition can create employment and can create growth for the region, which is so important. Where does finance come in? Well, finance will play a key role in this transition. We will need significant amounts of capital to finance this transition to a low carbon sustainable economy. And the amounts are staggering. I think, Eugene, you covered some of it already. And sustainable finance is needed to finance that. And we will need different instruments from what we're used to. We'll need innovative instruments like green loans, sustainability, linked loans, the bonds, the transition bonds that Sani spoke about. We'll need all of that. And what has been very encouraging on that front is that on the Asian side of things, all those instruments have continued to do well, even, you know, this year, which was by all accounts a very, very challenging year for the world's economy. In the first half of the year, you know, we saw something like $750 million worth of green and social bonds issued out of Singapore. So that's significant. And I think moving forward, we won't just be able to rely on some of these new instruments like the bonds and loans that I spoke about. We'll have to go even broader. We'll have to think about blended finance structures and how we can bring in concessional financing and other innovative structures. And, you know, we'll need to think, I think, a bit more strategically about how we can tap on ADB and other anchor investors. And so maybe with that context set, let me turn to, you know, what ACMF can do, right? And what it has done. So I think on the ASEAN front, ASEAN supervisors and exchanges have made significant progress. In the capital market space alone, a number of ACMF members have made ESG reporting a listing rule. And, you know, we have a number of our stock exchanges that are members of the UN Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative. And what has been really powerful about ACMF is how it has helped to weave, you know, some of these common threads across these initiatives to really deepen our green finance and sustainable finance markets while respecting the amazing diversity that is ASEAN. So I think, you know, we've spoken quite a bit today about the ASEAN Green, Social and Sustainability Bond Standards. And I think that's very helpful, but we can do better, do more, right? With perhaps the transition bond guidelines that Sani spoke about. Perhaps, you know, ASEAN sustainability linked bond standards in the future. So, you know, the sky's the limit and there's much more we can do. And I think while standards is a very important building block, a critical next step, as I think many of us have shared before, is how we find commonalities in our national taxonomies, right? So that we can maximize sustainable financing flows across the region. So many of our national banks actually operate in the region. And if we have, you know, better ASEAN taxonomies, or we do more work on this front, we will actually facilitate much more of that intra-regional financing activities. And on the MES front, we look forward to working with all our ACMF colleagues on this and many other initiatives.
Thank you very much, Zung and Julian. I think those were really, really fantastic points. And, you know, Zung, you were talking about how the ASEAN countries are actually vulnerable. And I remember reading an ADB report that we are going to lose 11% of GDP if we don't manage climate change by 2100. I mean, that's a very, very serious thing. 11% of GDP, certainly against the backdrop of the setbacks of COVID, is going to be very, very bad because we're going to have some deep scarring and we're going to have another impact again by 2100. And Jillian, your point about the, you know, how some of us are vulnerable nations, again, I think sometimes we forget that 6 of the 20 most vulnerable nations to climate change actually are ASEAN countries. And that aspect of sustainability with respect to ASEAN is something that totally cannot be understated. And as we talk about the diversity of ASEAN just now, something's just really crossed my mind. And if you look at ASEAN, we're 10 countries. We don't have an EU-like institutional structure. We do everything by consensus. Our GDPs range from per capita, range from 1,500 to 65,000. That's huge. When you talk to investors, sometimes they say ASEAN's 3 different markets, but yet the ACMF managed to get the ASEAN Green Bond Standards, the Sustainability Bond Standards, and the Social Bond Standards through. And that's really quite remarkable, given the diversity in its members. I'm just wondering, what is your recipe for success? What are the challenges you faced? And really, what are the lessons learned moving forward?
Yeah, Eugene, if you don't mind, I'd like to chime in on that. Okay, so I don't know if we can claim to have a recipe for success. I think the initial results, as you and Sadi have pointed out, are very encouraging. We came out with the Green Bond Standards in 2017, the Social and Sustainability Bond Standards in 2018, and about 3 to 2 years later, now in 2020, we have something like 7.5 billion US dollars worth of labeled bonds issued, with an additional 3 billion US dollars equivalent of aligned bonds. So maybe that's encouraging, but I'm not necessarily want to claim that as a recipe for success. But if you're asking why we've been able to move quite quickly on sustainability and achieve consensus on sustainability at the ACMF, and maybe I have like three or so possible reasons why. And the first is really what Zoom and Jillian already discussed in the first portion. There's a lot of consensus in ASEAN that climate change is a real challenge that we all face across all 10 countries. And not to belabor the point on typhoon, but just this morning we had our second storm cross the Philippine archipelago this morning. And storms are not supposed to be crossing the Philippine archipelago in October. That's unheard of. When I was a child, storms do not happen in October, but now they do. So it's a very, very real challenge that we are faced. And as Julian mentioned, we all need to continue to invest in our infrastructure in order to maintain our growth. And that infrastructure, because we are exposed to the challenges of climate change, needs to be climate resilient, climate adapted. Essentially, they need to be green. We need green infrastructure to have sustained growth in Southeast Asia. And so one of the things that we learned in 2016 is that there's actually a number of investors that have pooled together or are committed to investing in this kind of green and sustainable infrastructure. We weren't aware of this right away, but now, for example, in 2016, when we started this study, we had estimated that something like 21 trillion worth of assets under management were committed to the UN PRI, Principles for Responsible Investment. I think now it's estimated something like 103 trillion. And so the challenge that was posed to ACMF is, how do we help connect that possible investor pool with the infrastructure, the sustainable and green infrastructure that we need to finance in ASEAN, in Southeast Asia. And this is, I think, why ACMF has been able to have a consensus on this. Although we're 10 different jurisdictions with different levels of development, we're all capital market regulators, and our default mechanism really for managing the capital market and connecting investors with projects is disclosure. And that's why I think it was a natural fit for us. Now, in the beginning, we didn't know, what a green bond was, or what a green use of proceeds would be. We're not scientists, but we are capital market professionals. And that's why working together, and I think this is the third thing that helped us along, working together with valued partners like the ADB, and most especially ICMA, really helped us understand that there was already an existing green bond market. And there was already a set of principles that was guiding that market that ICMA helped to put together out there. And that by aligning our regulations to those principles and developing these ASEAN green bond standards, we could provide, on the one hand, guidance to domestic issuers on what kind of disclosure was necessary for them to attract that kind of investment, and at the same time provide assurance to those investors that ASEAN green bonds, ASEAN social and sustainability bonds, are adhere to international best practice, and there's no attempt at greenwashing or social washing here. And I think to really underscore that point, we made it a point to exclude fossil fuel power from use of proceeds, go beyond the ICMA principles, exclude certain activities like weaponry, alcohol, tobacco from acceptable social use of proceeds. And I think that's been the third pillar to what we've achieved so far, working together with the partners and with the larger capital market industry. Having said all that, we still have challenges. We still get the question, what is green? It's not always clear, despite the guidance we've put out. We always get the question, what is the business case? Why would you issue a green bond instead of a just plain vanilla bond? And then we also get the question, like, how do you do it? There are issuers who want to be able to issue, but they don't necessarily know how to come up with their own green selection framework. So these are some of the challenges we still continue to face in ASEAN. But I think this approach of close cooperation with the private sector and the wider green and sustainable market has really helped us out.
The response from Commissioner Matong, personally, I see that for the achievement of the ACMF, our ACMF, that the standards, because the principle of ASEAN is consensus-based decision making. So among capital market regulators, the harmonized standards are very, very important. So the achievement for us is that ASEAN Green Bond Standard, social and sustainability bond standards are very important. And we see that the awareness improvement, public awareness improvement on sustainability is an achievement for us. And very important for our regulators. It's also one of the source, or one of the force for the change of the rules and also requirements of ASEAN member state in terms of having the standards for the green investment. Because the capital market is only getting the mobilized funds for the investment, but the observe of the industry companies need to be, following up the industrial standards, so that it's easier for the investment from the capital market into the real life. And we see that now for national rules and regulations among ASEAN are being revised to be aligned with the ASEAN Green Bond Standards. Seen very important. And the challenges we face and we are facing now from the regulatory point of view is that rule-based and principle-based approaches among members are things we have to work on. And for the transparency of the green products, green bond, is very important. But you see the languages we use for the sustainability disclosure, we have different languages in ASEAN. So it's not very much convenient for outside ASEAN investors outside ASEAN to look into the ASEAN as an asset class, the green asset class. And ASEAN is now lacking of the supporting institutions like third-party opinion institution for ASEAN, especially for green bonds. So I think that there are still a lot of things for ACMF capital market regulators to sit together to work on and to expand our initiatives for green asset class for ASEAN.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Eugene, sorry, if I
yes,
could I just maybe add on that? I think one other point, perhaps, that work for ASEAN is I think many of the stakeholders actually came on board quite quickly. Once we got the agenda going, the different stakeholders, not just the regulators, but also from the private sector, the government. All the governments have made commitments to the various global initiatives. So the agenda was there. There was commonality among the national, the sustainability agenda at the national level. And therefore, in my view, it was easier to actually coordinate that at the ASEAN level.
Oh, thank you very much for all those useful comments. It's very interesting that ACMF actually has not rested on its laurels. In fact, the very fact that you said it's encouraging Commissioner Matong and Director General Zung, it's encouraging, but you can do more, is something which I believe creates the platform for ASEAN to move even further and faster. So I noticed that earlier this month, the ASEAN finance ministers and governors at the annual meeting had endorsed and welcomed the ACMF's finalized actionable recommendations under the roadmap for ASEAN Sustainable Capital Markets. Now, there's been a lot of talk about this roadmap, and the roadmap, the way I understand it, is a living document. The endorsement from the ministers and governments, I think, and governors is something which I think shouldn't be, again, understated. It's quite a recognition and it's quite an achievement. And I understand the roadmap also contains your plans, particularly for the next 5 years. We have actually a question from one of the participants about how we are going to manage the taxonomy in ASEAN, given the different stages of development of our member countries. And I'm wondering, what's the roadmap all about? Will it address issues like that?
Maybe I can come in at this stage, Eugene, thanks. Well, I think the roadmap is a major initiative for the ACMF. And I think just to follow on from the earlier remarks from my colleagues, ACMF colleagues, I think the consensus that we achieved during the development of the three bond standards, the green, social, and sustainable bond standards, I think serve as sort of a motivation for us to explore further what else can we do collectively as ASEAN to develop the sustainability agenda. And in this regard, I think the idea of that roadmap was mooted subsequently and agreed upon by all the member states of ASEAN. And I think we're also very fortunate to have the support of ADB in terms of the work that we needed to do in developing this roadmap. So work started in last year in 2019, and it was completed in the first quarter of this year, and it was made public in May 2020. Essentially, I think the objective of having this roadmap is really for us to provide a broad strategic direction to the capital market regulators in terms of developing the ecosystem for sustainable market or sustainable finance. And I think what we wanted to do was create a vibrant and facilitative ecosystem that will enable mobilization of private sector financing to work towards development of sustainable projects and sustainable initiatives. So this was actually the primary objective of having this roadmap. And I think the content of the roadmap, as you could see from the slide, it was built upon four sort of priority areas that we have sort of compiled and clustered according to what you can see on the slides. So the first priority area is really about strengthening foundations. This is fundamental for us. I think for us to build a sound ecosystem for sustainable finance, we would need to have the foundations to be strong, and where there's already foundation for us to enhance it further. And in this regard, I think disclosure we felt was a key area, and both from the issuer perspective or from the corporate sustainability disclosures. So we are promoting as one of the recommendations under this priority area. And similarly for institutional investors to undertake disclosures through stewardship codes, for example, in order to send a message across in terms of their own practices, as well as enabling or encouraging more investee companies, for example, to adopt sustainability practices. The other recommendation under the first priority area, as we have sort of touched on earlier, is the need for taxonomy. Eugene, I think this is one area where, yes, the roadmap intends to address the issue of taxonomy. I think Gillian mentioned this earlier as well. And I think if we also take note that this is not, sort of a low-hanging fruit, so to speak, that there is a lot of areas that we need and factors that we need to take into consideration to accommodate sort of national or localized requirements, as well as to make it also widely acceptable at the global or regional level. So trying to get that balance is important, and therefore, this is an important aspect of the roadmap, the recommendation that we will take up. As you can see, the commitment in terms of the roadmap is for us to examine the common taxonomy in order for us to try and achieve that commonality in the longer term. And fourth, again, an issue that has been brought up earlier is in terms of developing transition standards. So members of the ACMF will be exploring this recommendation. And under priority area 2, I think having addressed or in addressing the foundations, we also need to have solutions for the market. Right? So this priority area 2 talks about catalyzing products and also enabling access to underserved areas. The first recommendation under this pillar is actually in developing a sustainable and responsible fund standards. And this is work that we feel will be a priority for the ACMF. And this will also, under this pillar, will also include initiative to improve further market access for sustainable products. For example, introduction of possibly green lane for SRI or sustainable funds to be marketed across the different ASEAN markets. We're also looking at developing ESG indices to also facilitate, not only for benchmarking, but also facilitate further product development that are based on such indices. The next recommendation is using technology, where we believe technology is a given, the use of technology is a given, and this can be harnessed to facilitate greater cross-border participation, particularly in this regard for sustainable products across ASEAN. And I think for a relatively nascent area, incentives is important. And And while we have undertaken initiatives to develop the bond standards, I think we're also looking at how we can incentivize sort of usage of those standards, operationalization of the standards, as well as incentives for other products as well. And moving on to the third area, I think we are looking at creating more awareness among all stakeholders, as well as building capacity and capabilities. So in this regard, technical competency is something we have identified to be of importance. And this cuts across the different stakeholder groups, the regulators, the issuers, the advisors, and also in terms of understanding by the investors as well. And one of the initiatives that we are also recommending under this priority area is for knowledge transfer to be undertaken among member countries, as well as with parties outside the ASEAN region, so that we can harness and also gain knowledge that has been already developed in other jurisdictions. And I think the third recommendation under this area or pillar would be the more generic or general public awareness, so that it reaches including not just the institutional investors, but also retail investors and other stakeholders, to really profile the importance of the sustainability agenda. And if I could go to the fourth pillar, I think this is where the recommendations help to connect the three earlier priority areas and also facilitate the implementation of the recommendation across the ASEAN countries. So one is in terms of developing a database that will be made available publicly, where it will capture the various aspects of the sustainability agenda. One is to capture projects that are available in the region, what are the products that are available in terms of solutions to address some of the sustainable agenda, and also the database on investors. And we also have work that is being initiated in terms of looking at the other types of stakeholders. And in this regard, the work that's already been done by multilateral and philanthropic organizations can be leveraged upon for us to further promote the agenda, particularly in terms of social finance. And last but not least, I think what is important is to have this coordination between the public and the private sectors, including the financial sectors, in order for us to really get the benefit of the expertise of the different segments of the market to operationalize these recommendations. Perhaps at this stage, I also should also indicate that the recommendations are quite broadly based. You take into account that the different levels of development of capital market among the member countries, and in particular also in terms of the development of the sustainability agenda among our member countries. And as you can see from the slides, there are the 6 areas where it has been highlighted with an asterisk, recommendation 1, 2, 5, 6, 11, and 15. And these have been identified as immediate priority areas for us to roll out within the short to medium term. But as Eugene has mentioned, this is a living document, and as a proof to that, I think if we do look at recommendation 4, for example, in terms of looking at transition standards, while this has not been earlier identified as a priority area, but given developments in the global market, in the sustainability space, this is something which we have recognized to be of priority as well. So this area will also be looked at much more immediately rather than later. Perhaps if I could just end, Eugene, just to bring in the report that was undertaken by another entity, which is the Working Committee for Capital Market Development, where these members are represented by the central banks, the Ministry of Finance, as well as capital market regulators, and where they have come up with a report on promoting sustainable finance in the ASEAN capital markets. And their focus is really on quasi-government and government sectors. And this is where I think ACMF and the WCCMD will actually work very closely together in order to achieve common goals under our respective sustainability agenda.
Right.
Thanks,
Thank
Eugene.
you very much, Islan. Are there any comments from the other panelists?
Eugene, if I could just add like a couple of words on taxonomy and transition standards. Everyone should at least know that I'm probably the one that was or is most concerned or skeptical about taxonomy. As I said a while ago, part of the challenge that we faced as capital market regulators is we're not scientists, so it's very difficult for us to be in a position to say, oh, such and such carbon reduction makes a building green, or such and such power generation through wind or solar makes it green. Because again, we're not scientists. I think there was a question a while ago about the possibility of green coal or clean coal being considered. And as I mentioned, under the ASEAN standards, there's no such thing as clean coal or green coal. No fossil fuel power generation is considered a green use of proceeds. And the reason we were able to adopt that position in 2017 is because we were told by the scientists in 2017 that's an oxymoron. There's no such thing as clean or green coal. So we followed the scientists. So having said that, having said that it's difficult for capital market regulators to come up with this kind of taxonomy, I have to agree with all my colleagues that, again, we keep getting the question, what is green? And we need a response for that question. And as much as possible, we need a response that's consistent across all 10 countries, just like the standards have been consistent across 10 countries. I think Zung mentioned that we speak different languages across ASEAN, but our understanding of what is allowable use of proceeds, essentially the goal of the taxonomy to identify what is considered green, social, or sustainable, although difficult, is something that I now feel personally that we must embark on. And I think, as Islan mentioned, this is not low-hanging fruit. This is very, very difficult. I feel very, very underqualified to try to attempt this. But I think there's also consensus across my fellow colleagues across the 10 countries that this is something that we must do in order to move the sustainability agenda forward. And we hope our partnership with entities like ICMA and ADB and other multilateral agencies who have the technical capacity will make this project more viable. The other thing I want to say very quickly is on transition. This is something that we are interested in because it could open up more issuers to enter the green space. We have received a lot of concern by some conglomerates who have a variety of investments, some in clearly green areas, like let's say water, but also have some exposure to fossil fuel or in manufacturing where they still make use of fossil fuel. And many of these issuers become concerned that it might not be proper for them to pursue green finance if not all of their businesses are green at the moment. So we think transition might be a very powerful tool to allow companies who do want to move towards a greener path to find a way and not feel inhibited. And we think this is something that would also be inclusive across all 10 countries, across all stages of development, a way for our companies to make the commitment to transition, even if they cannot do so overnight. So I think transition is very important. Our partnership with ICMA, we are an observer to the ICMA process. Islan is actually our representative to the advisory board of the ICMA Green Social Sustainability Bond Principles. We are observing closely the development of transition bonds and sustainability-linked bonds as possible tools to allow this broader participation in green finance. And let me just end there for now.
Great. Thank you very much. Those were really interesting comments. We had some questions from participants asking about the taxonomy and the transition bonds. And I think through the conversations just now, we've answered them as well as we can in a 1-hour session. These are debates that can go on for years. And of course, the other thing is questions about how we are going to attract investors into ASEAN. And the roadmap seems to deal with quite a lot of those aspects, from setting up databases to creating more awareness and pathways as well. But some of the points you raised collectively just now are very important in my mind. The first is about inclusivity. And one of the recipes for success, if I can go back to that term again, for ASEAN has been its ability to be inclusive and to include everyone in ASEAN, notwithstanding the stages of development. The second is actually this issue about transition and whether or not perfect should be the enemy of good. I guess because of the disparity in development in ASEAN and the different sort of agendas the member states have, it's quite important to adopt both a revolutionary and an evolutionary approach towards energy transition, because there will be countries who are prepared to do something, and that could be quite revolutionary, but it may leave others behind. So it is important to have both tracks in ASEAN going. And I say that because ASEAN is actually a very, very major player in the decarbonization game. And there have been statistics to show that if ASEAN, China, and India don't meet the decarbonization targets that have been set for them, or they set themselves, then the gains from efforts in other parts of the world will actually be cancelled out. So that's how important ASEAN is in this global agenda that concerns all of us. Which leads me to my final question to the panelists today. Where do you see ASEAN's voice to be? And where do you see ASEAN in the global agenda for sustainability and carbon reduction?
Yeah, no, thanks, Eugene. I mean, I think ASEAN absolutely can and must play a significant role in global sustainability efforts. You know, you pointed it out really well just now, and MAS Managing Director Ravi Menon has put it beautifully when he said that, you know, to move the needle on global emissions, Asia must move. It's as simple as that. So I think that Asia and the ASEAN voice must come out strongly in international conversations on sustainability and finance, right? And why? I would submit there are 3 reasons. First, this would ensure that our unique perspectives, our unique journey towards a low carbon future are supported by and in sync with international developments. And we spoke earlier about typhoons and extreme weather and physical climate change risks. But, you know, if I can just steer the conversation slightly somewhere else, there are actually many growth opportunities for ASEAN and many positives here. Let me just cite one example, which I think was crystallized more recently after, you know, May 2020, when our ACMF roadmap was firmed up. And that really is the attention that COVID-19 shed on the resilience and sustainability of supply chains and how important that is. And really post-COVID, we're seeing this trend towards diversification in supply chains. We are also seeing corporates taking action to look at their supply chains and to tackle carbon emissions, deforestation, and other unsustainable practices in their supply chains. And many of these corporates, including the ones outside ASEAN, have their supply chains or a leg of their supply chains in ASEAN. So this is definitely an area where ASEAN's role and leadership will be critical. The second reason why ASEAN must be part of the international conversation is that cross-border harmonization will be critical for us to scale up sustainable finance so that we can fund our own transition to a low carbon economy. And I think this was in line with some of the points made earlier. We will need some degree of international harmonization and disclosures and standards if we are going to drive international capital flows to ASEAN, which is also needed. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, I just want to point out an obvious point, right? Which is that all of us here, ACMF, we have much to offer the international community, and we can actively contribute to global discourse. You know, I thought Islan's sharing about the ACMF roadmap was brilliant just now, because it lays out, you know, this amazing plan and this very clear vision. We can share that working model with more of our global colleagues. We have extreme weather, yes, as we discussed, but we also have certain keys that can unlock solutions, like, for example, carbon credits. So I always take comfort in the fact that so much of the nature-based solutions actually are in ASEAN, you know, and we can help to frame these NBSs, these nature-based solutions, to serve as strong carbon offsets, for example. We've, you know, got these mangroves and, you know, other solutions that we can provide and bring to the table. Of course, much more thought, much more research will be needed here. But again, ASEAN and ACMF can play a leading role in this. Yeah, that's all in the interest of time. But I just wanted to say that there's so many areas, and I think to some extent we're already contributing on the world stage through platforms like IPSF and so on.
Thank you very much, Gillian. Maybe just a last comment from the panelists.
Well, I think maybe I just pick up on your last question also, Eugene, maybe just to add on to what Gillian has said, and I think F has sort of alluded to. ASEAN and ACMF is already recognized by our membership in the ICMA Advisory Council. I think that is very important for us also to have our voice heard and to have that representation in such a global platform. And I think we do need to sort of push further in terms of our initiatives, and in doing so, I think we shouldn't be too shy in trying to profile it more widely, so that the rest of the world could see what ASEAN is all about, the opportunities here. As you said, we will be, as a bloc, the fourth largest trading bloc in 2050, and you just look at the numbers that ADB came up, even though it's a pre-COVID assessment or projection, but about over $3 trillion are required for ASEAN countries to be invested up to 2030, over a 15-year period to 2030, on infrastructure. And a lot of these infrastructure projects can and we believe should try to comply with requirements of sustainability. And this would attract investors, this would attract stakeholders, participants, and also those who believe in the ASEAN story. I think we have a great story here. And I think that's something which, as I said, we should share with the rest of the world.
Great, thank you very much. I wish we had more time, but it's been a great panel session. I'd like to thank the panelists for sharing their views, and all the participants for joining us today. As an ASEAN citizen, I'm certainly very comforted and encouraged by the things that the capital market regulators are doing to help promote this agenda, which is absolutely critical to all of us. So thank you again. Back to you, Mushtaq.
Thank you very much, Eugene. It was a super interesting panel and actually very inspiring as well. Thank you, Gillian, for the very positive words at the end. Well, that's all the time we have today for this webinar. Thank you all very much for joining. And also the roadmap that has been referenced during this discussion is available publicly on the ACMF website. We'll also be sending a link to that from ICMA, and you can feel free to share that publicly. Thank you very much for joining this virtual event. We wish you good health, a peaceful week ahead. Take care.